Okay, well, for those who might not have been here last week, kind of going through the class I had for the young adults in Kentucky about the rebirth of Israel. Hope everybody on Zoom calls doing good. Last time we started with the prophecies concerning AD 70 and the destruction of Israel and Jerusalem. And then pretty much the Roman-Jewish wars from 66 AD to 136 AD with the climax being the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. But then we looked at some of the prophecies about the return and that Israel would again be a nation and some of the things concerning how that would happen. And these prophecies are why believers throughout all the centuries that the Jews were scattered, why they knew and said confidently that Israel would be a nation again. The Jews would have to return. And since their dispersion, the Jews understood this, or many of them did, or at least they longed to return, because even as they were scattered to their distant lands, they always ended their Passovers with next year in Jerusalem. For so almost 2,000 years, they would say next year in Jerusalem, just hoping to return. And we looked at how completely the Jewish Commonwealth was destroyed to the extent that the common language of Hebrew itself died out. In religious functions, it maintained, but it was very limited. And in this time, the land was under foreign oppression by a bunch of different powers. And as we looked at last time, in Luke 21, this period's called the times of the Gentiles. And it says that Jerusalem shall be trodden underfoot until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. So we saw that this period, it would end, and the Jews would be regathered, and Israel would be reborn. The question is, when and how would this be accomplished? Now, the Jews, as they were in their distant lands, imagine many of their generations were in these different countries, so that was, for most Jews, that was their home country. And they tried to assimilate as much as they could. But as the Lord's witnesses, as those people who would always testify to his existence, God would not allow them to do that. And there's a bunch of different things throughout this period that were just testament to the fact that the Jews could not assimilate. This first thing, and we're just going to mention three things. There's so many other different things that happened. But in 1290, this was called the Edict of Expulsion. This was actually in Britain at the time. The Jews in Britain, because of their wealth and their success, as we've seen so many other times before, they were persecuted and singled out, and they were seen as enemies of the state. So in 1290, Britain issued this Edict of Expulsion, which kicked all the Jews out of Britain. And actually, we think of the Nazis were the first to actually give the Jews bands that they wore to mark them as Jews, but it was actually Britain. In 1218, before this, you can see it kind of progressing. In 1218, all the Jews in Britain were made to wear these marking bands. So that's not necessarily anything new. A few years later, there was the Spanish Inquisition, absolutely terrible thing. It started out strictly against the Jews, and you can guess that was in Spain. And pretty much it's the same thing. They were wealthy, they were considered enemies of the state, and they were gathered, forced to confess to things that they hadn't done and killed. And it eventually grew to not just include Jews, but a bunch of other people, as these movements typically kind of do. But I mean, this lasted for almost 400 years. It's relatively recently that this thing was stamped out. But this was a huge form of persecution that caused the Jews to scatter and try to get back to the land and seek some form of refuge. And then lastly, at least what we'll mention, are these pogroms, which took place between the 1800s and into the 1900s. And in some extent, they even happen to today. Which these are raids on Jewish neighborhoods, destruction of their businesses, they're killed. I mean, a lot of terrible things. But the main thing being, throughout this whole time, the Jews were never at rest in their lands. Certain of them enjoyed more comfortable lives than others, but as a people, they were not accepted by the nations that they lived in. So, I mean, and all these things kind of very slowly brought them back to the land. Now, the land wasn't an independent Jewish state, but I'm talking about just a dozen came to the land this year, or a few hundred. Very small numbers comparatively speaking, but it's a very gradual process. A lot of them wanted to return, but they didn't know how, or they wouldn't be allowed in. But others, a lot of things they had to come together at the same time for this actually for them to return. There's a linguistic aspect if they lost their language. There's the political aspect, and there's also the moral aspect. So how do we kind of think that God would bring Israel back? I mean, what methods would he use and that he has used in the past? Well, he worked through man, just like how the scriptures show God working in the governments of man, though man is unaware of it. Daniel 4:17, most of us are familiar with this. The Most High ruleth in the kingdoms of men, in the kingdom of men, and gives it to whomsoever he will, and sets up over it the basest of men. So God works in the governments of the world. And there's all kinds of scriptural examples of this. The first thing I think of was Pharaoh in Egypt. We're told by Paul in Romans 9, the scripture saith unto Pharaoh, even for this same purpose have I raised thee up, that I might show my power in thee, that my name might be declared throughout all the earth. God set this Pharaoh in order who had a certain disposition against the Jews who didn't know Joseph and all the things that they had done for Egypt. And his role was to essentially not to let the Jews go, so God's strong right arm might be shown. But God, here it says that God raised him up for this purpose. Now, do we think Pharaoh knew this? Obviously not. There's no hint whatsoever that Pharaoh knew God's purpose with him. And the same thing's kind of seen in Daniel 10:13 and chapter 11:1, just where the angels talk about, the king of Persia withstood me certain days, and he had to help from Michael, and influencing the rulers in the earth without the rulers knowing it. So the same concept applies, I think, to how Israel would be reborn. And the reason I say that is because God said Israel would be reborn. It's God who is regathering the Jews and bringing about the Jewish state. So it only makes sense that it's God who is working with the people who make this possible. And I think it's the thinking of the world today, I guess, that in order for something to be done by God, it kind of has to be miraculous, that you can't trace back, cause and effect and see why things happened. But that's how God typically has worked and as demonstrated in the Word. He works through his creation. Even when God brought the children of Israel into the land under Joshua, I mean, relatively speaking, there's very few, as far as battles go and conquering, there are very few instances where it's a miraculous thing that happens. I don't think I've got any verses on this right now, but I think we talk about it a little bit later, that most of the things that God did, it was blessing the children of Israel. I'm probably getting ahead of myself, but for example, with Ai, I mean, that was strictly tactics. God told Joshua, you need to go over to this place and do this and do this. So it's not like God called down fire from heaven to destroy Ai. He told Joshua, here's what you guys need to do, and I will bless your efforts. And in a similar fashion, God has been working through these previous ages. But it's still God who's doing it. But in order for Israel to come back as a nation, there's a number of things that have to happen. And I mean, these aren't necessarily in any list of importance. Some of them might even be redundant, but they must occur. So first, in order for Israel to be a nation again, you got to clear the land of whoever's there already, these foreign powers, which means the Jews must be back in the land. They have to have a native language, a common language that unifies them, and there has to be a government to rule the land. Importantly, they have to be recognized as a nation by other powers in the world. And one example of this are the Kurds in Turkey. They claim to be a distinct people. They want a nation of their own, but nobody recognizes them as a nation, so they're not a nation. And lastly, this kind of goes with the government, but they also have to have a ruler to rule the country or the nation. Now, one of the biggest tools that the Lord used to bring about this return was Zionism. And some people say that Zionism started in the late 1800s. Some people say that it started as soon as Judah was destroyed, because they always longed for a return back to their ancient homeland. And that's what Zionism is. It's the movement to reassemble the Jews to their ancient homeland. And this is actually taken from Mount Zion in Jerusalem. So the name itself is tied to their ancient land. Now this began in the late 1800s. And I think this is the first clear sign that the times of the Gentiles was nearing an end. Because we saw that there were periods of persecution throughout all the time. But once you get to this, I mean, if you were to look at persecution on a graph, it's going straight up starkly. I mean, it's really picking up pace. And there's a clear change of tone and pace. But there's a big issue. David Ben-Gurion, he would later become the first prime minister of Israel. He came to Jerusalem the first time in 1906. And it says here, this is from a book called Old Jerusalem, what he discovered in Jerusalem was a Tower of Babel. At the spiritual center of Judaism, or Jerusalem, the shocked young man found Jews speaking to each other in 40 different languages, half of them unable to communicate with the other half. So when he came, there were some Jews there, but 40 different languages were spoken. I can't even name 40 languages. I can think of like 8 maybe. And naturally, if you have this many people speaking different languages, they're only going to associate with the people they can speak to. I mean, that's exactly what happened at the Tower of Babel. The people who they understood, they congregated together, and they didn't really have much relationship with the others that they couldn't understand for obvious reasons. So this is a huge problem, because there's no way they could ever unite if they can't even talk to each other. But the scripture said that the Hebrew language itself would revive. This is in Jeremiah 31, 23 and 24. It's an incredible passage. It says, "Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, as yet they shall use this speech in the land of Judah and in the cities thereof, when I shall bring again their captivity. The Lord bless thee, O habitation of justice, and mountain of holiness. And there shall dwell in Judah itself, and in all the cities thereof together, husbandmen, and they that go forth with flocks." Now, what speech was the prophet speaking at this time? What language did Jeremiah and the Jews speak? It was Hebrew. I mean, and that's what he says here. And in the time that this is spoken, it probably sounds kind of weird, because he says, I'm talking to you in Hebrew, but you're also going to be speaking Hebrew when I bring you back into from the captivity, which implies that there would be a point when they would not speak Hebrew, which is exactly what happened. But when they came back, they would use that speech. I'm trying to use this laser pointer on a TV screen. It's not working very well. And I think this is also the beginnings of Zephaniah 3:9. It says, "For then will I turn to the people a pure language, that they may all call upon the name of the Lord to serve him with one consent." Hebrew, it's the language of the prophets. It's the language that God spoke to Abraham and to Moses with. This is how the 10 Commandments were given. And Hebrew is almost undoubtedly the original language. Before all the other ones were created at Babel, it's almost undoubtedly the original language. And what I think this verse means is that, similar to what the Jews faced, and when Ben-Gurion came, they all spoke different languages. I think part of the role, or what's going to happen when Christ returns in the kingdom age, is there's not going to be all these different tongues in the earth. The whole earth is going to return to this pure language that they all may learn and talk in one consent and understanding. So, and I think in this time period, the late 1800s we're talking about, is the very beginnings of this. Obviously, it's not completely fulfilled, but it's the beginnings of that. So now I want to turn our attention to some of the figures that God would use to accomplish this purpose. Just as he worked through Pharaoh, just as he worked through Nebuchadnezzar and countless other rulers, so he would also utilize these people. And again, the reason we say this is because these are the people that brought about or were integral to furthering these prophecies, whether they knew it or not. The first, his name, when he was born at least, was Eleazar Perelman. Later, he would call himself Eleazar ben Yehuda. He was born 1858, and you'll see that many of these important figures were born within, in this 1850s to early or late 1800s. Sorry. In this time period, a lot of integral figures were going to be born, and he was the first. Now, he learned as a child ancient Hebrew in his religious studies. Again, he would not be able to speak it in a, just as a common conversation, but in their religious circles, he could speak it. It's kind of used like Latin today in some sense. But he was a believing man, and he wanted to be a doctor originally. But in 1875, something kind of changed his life, and I'm skeptical of these things typically, but because this is so directly related to prophecy, and as I think we'll see the importance of this later on, I can only reason that this is one of the few only authentic things, just because of the role that this one thing played in his life. And he says, a light flashed across the sky as if lightning struck. Then an incandescent light radiated before my eyes, and I was transported to the passage of the Jordan where the children of Israel crossed into the promised land. Suddenly a great voice rang in my eyes and spoke. That's probably his ears, I think it should say. Suddenly a great voice rang in his ears and spoke 3 times the words, the return of the people to the language and the land. Another thing I think is interesting about this is usually when visions are shown, like in the instance of Peter, the unclean animals that came down, it was shown to him 3 times. And again, this is a vision. I mean, I don't think he was literally transported somewhere. But I think he was shown this 3 times, the return of the people to the language and the land. Now, he didn't really understand what it meant, didn't act upon it immediately at the time. But later, this became the one driving force in his life. Now, 3 years later, 1878, he was diagnosed with tuberculosis. And in the early or mid 1800s, there's not a whole lot they can do with that. And the doctor told him, you got about a year to live. So instead of spending his last year of trying to be a doctor, he decided, I'm going to apply myself to this thing that happened to me. So the land of Israel, obviously it wasn't Israel, we'll call it Palestine, it was under Ottoman control. So he moved to Ottoman Palestine to further this work. And he found it, again, like Ben-Gurion saw many years later, there was a language issue, but the land itself was desolate. And this is when he changed his name to Ben Yehuda, which means son of Judah. A lot of these people, they took their native names and they Hebraicized it. I think that's the word it is. And almost single-handedly, he resurrected the Hebrew language. He wanted it to be the native language of the Jews in the land. But the thing is, I mean, if you think from 135 with the Bar Kokhba revolt, that was the last big scattering of the Jews. From 135 all the way up to 1880 or so, there's a lot of new words and phrases that came into being. Things like gun and, not chariot, but lots of, all the medical tools, professions, there was literally not words for these things. So he had to make them. One interesting example is, like I said, gun. There's no word in the Bible for gun. But the word, he thought, okay, well, David's sling put a hole in Goliath's head. That's kind of what guns do. So he just used the word for David's sling for gun. So he turned to the scriptures themselves to try to come up with new words and phrases. But there was also the issue of how to pronounce these things. So he was a really intelligent man. He knew a bunch of different languages. So they also kind of had to figure out, how do we even say these things? In an effort to try to have others learn this language, he actually started a newspaper. It was completely in Hebrew. There was no word for newspaper at the time, so he called it Hazvi, which is the gazelle. I'm not sure why he chose that, but that was a word he knew and used. And he also started a dictionary to compile all the words he was creating. Now he had a son, and his son was the first person in probably about 2,000 years to be a Hebrew speaker from youth. I mean, him and his wife had a rule: we will only speak to him in Hebrew. So that's the language he knows. He also started schools in Palestine, and I'm just going to call it Palestine because that's what everybody referred to it at the time. That was in 1890. And he was the first real advocate to get other Jews to the land. People back in his homeland. He said, you guys need to come here. You need to help me with this. And because of what he did and his efforts, there's some pictures of the land, by the way. These are the malarial swamps that covered the land. And where it wasn't swamps, it was desert and pretty much useless soil. But because of his efforts, Hebrew became one of the official languages of Palestine, a British mandatory Palestine in 1921. So he lived to see that at least, but a year later he died. Now, by 1948, had Ben Yehuda not revived the Hebrew language, it's estimated the Jews in Israel or in Palestine would have spoken between 70 and 80 different languages. Because of all the other things that happened in the time period that drew them to the land, they'd be speaking 70 to 80 different languages. But because of this, they were actually able to unify. Now, obviously, as others came in, in the late 1940s from, Czechoslovakia, they didn't speak Hebrew. So there was still some issue, but most of it had been overcome thanks to his efforts. Next dude, he's kind of a scary-looking dude if you look at the bottom middle picture there. Theodor Herzl. He was born 2 years after Eliezer in 1860 in Budapest. He spoke and he was raised on the German heritage and language, but he was a Jew by lineage, I guess you could say it like that. But he was an assimilated Jew and a journalist, and he was secular as well. But he really saw the Jewish persecution increasing. Now, this is not him saying this, but this is a very popular writer in Europe at the time, speaking to how the Jews were perceived. And he says the Jews of France were not Frenchmen, even though many of these people have been living there for, I don't know how many years, I don't know if thousands is right, but many, many, many years. They're not Frenchmen, but a guest people who exploited the economic system for their own benefit and for world domination. And so that's essentially the position of most of these countries where the Jews were at. Now, originally, Herzl thought the answer to persecution was complete assimilation and conversion to Christianity. That obviously was not going to work. People told him it wasn't going to work. But his life's really interesting as well, because you can see, I think, God working through that to put him in certain places at strategic times, particularly in relation to when he was moved to France. I think many of us have heard of the Dreyfus Affair. That's Alfred Dreyfus on the right there. He was a French artillery officer. He'd been in the service for 15 years. In 1894, he was falsely accused of espionage and treason against France. There was no evidence for this at all, except for the fact that he was of Jewish descent. I mean, he served in the military. He had moved up the ranks in the military. He was proud of his French citizenship. And he was a very decorated person. You can't see it in the picture on the right there, but he had awards and medals and things like that. But that didn't matter because he was of Jewish descent. In 1895, he was actually convicted of treason, and they stripped him of all the medals and honors he had. And as this happened, the crowds not just derailed him, but they chanted, "Death to the traitor, death to the Jews, death to all Jews." And Herzl very closely followed this story, and that chanting of the crowd really shook him because it showed him that it's not just Jews who are really wealthy and there's reason to be envious. These are Jews who moved up the ranks, who showed dedication to the countries they lived in. So no matter how high up you went or low you were, if you were a Jew, you were going to be persecuted against. Um, so Herzl saw this and thought the only way we can continue as a people is to have a homeland of our own. So motivated, unlike ever before, he locked himself in his room and he wrote, I'm going to say this wrong because it's German, but Der Judenstaat, or the Jewish state. Dreyfus was convicted in 1895. 1896 is when he published this, and immediately it was translated into a bunch of different languages and spread throughout the world. A lot of people look at this as the first really big step for Zionism. Now, if you read it, it's kind of unrealistic in some of its expectations and what it was aspiring to, but it's the spirit of it that captured people. And then he traveled all over the world to convince people of this thing. So, I mean, a lot of people look at him as the father of the Zionist movement, even though Ben Yehuda had already kind of been doing similar things. But again, he wasn't a religious Jew, to start with at least. He was secular. He didn't care about necessarily a return to the homeland, their ancient homeland. And originally, he suggested somewhere in Argentina. I don't know exactly what it was about Argentina, but that's where he suggested. But as he, throughout this process, he really looked into his Jewish heritage, and then he finally changed and thought, okay, it needs to be our ancient homeland, Palestine. Now, he met Ben Yehuda in Palestine, and you'd kind of think these two visionaries kind of have similar aspirations. They'd get along. Herzl only stayed about a 5-minute meeting for Ben Yehuda, and he came away thinking, he wrote in his diary that, kind of like he's not a lunatic, but he's kind of crazy. Like, there's no way they're going to be able to learn Hebrew. Herzl thought German's a good language. That's what we need to be speaking. So he only gave him 5 minutes, and it wasn't that great. And he thought Ben Yehuda's efforts were kind of a vain waste of time. But either way, they both served their purpose. In 1897, it was the first Zionist Congress was held. Now, this is the very first representative Jewish body in almost probably about 1900 years. It was held in Basel, Switzerland. I mean, think about that for a minute. The change that this represents from, after the Jews had just been scattered, the temple destroyed and everything. I mean, they sold into slavery, many of them killed, and now they have a Congress. I mean, they rented out this hall, but they have a representative body only for the Jews. And you can actually see that's Herzl there at the bottom, and they always hung this picture in the back, this map of Palestine, because this was their rallying call: Zionism, a return to Zion. Now, actually, he tried to get the Ottomans, who ruled the land at the time, to allow the Jews to return. He actually traveled there, spoke to the Sultan. One of the big things that Ottomans had issues with was their enormous debt. And because a lot of these Jews who were Zionists were pretty wealthy, Herzl offered the Sultan, he said, we will pay off all of your debts if you just give us Palestine. And interestingly, he kind of toyed with the idea for a little bit, but pretty much it came down to the fact that they were Muslims. Palestine was considered their holy land, even though they neglected it and let it fall into waste, and it didn't go through. So he tried to get the return, even paying off their debts, but it was turned down. But he kept trying, and this had a terrible toll on his health. You can imagine how stressful this was. But then something changed for him in 1903. These are called the Kishinev pogrom. It was terrible, like a lot of these other pogroms. There were people killed, injured, raped, businesses destroyed, whole neighborhoods decimated. And this kind of shook Herzl and thought, okay, yes, we want to return to Palestine, but there's no way we can do this soon. We need something more immediate. So he kind of started to bend a little bit on his vision. He said, okay, I don't care where we go, we just need somewhere to go. So interestingly, Britain had offered a place in Uganda. I think it's kind of a weird place, right in the middle of Africa. And Herzl presented this at the 6th Zionist Congress in 1903. And this really shook the delegates because they're used to coming in for 5 years in a row and they see this map of Palestine, but this time it wasn't Palestine, it was a map of Uganda. So immediately everybody's on edge and thinking, what on earth is going on here? It was a huge blow to the morale. It actually divided the Zionists. But the biggest thing is, did God say, I'm going to bring you to Uganda or the middle of Africa? He said, no. You might remember some of the passages we looked back at. It said, I'm going to bring you to the land of your fathers. It was their ancient homeland God was going to return them to. But Herzl, because of these things, was willing to settle. And he actually died in 1904, a year later. He was only 44 years old from cardiac sclerosis. I think it was largely stress. Interestingly, the whole British offer of Uganda was quietly rescinded anyways because just like every other country where the Jews tried to go, the people who lived in Uganda, they didn't want the Jews there. And they threw a fit, and Britain said, okay, never mind. We're not going to send them there. But his death actually paved the way for a more focused person. I think Herzl was integral to getting the Jews of the world to want to return, but because he started to waver from their ancient homeland, God had another person that was going to fill this role. His name is Chaim Weizmann. That's how we say it. You can call him Chaim Weizmann. Truman called him Cham because he didn't know how to say his first name. He was born in Poland in 1874. Now, he was influenced by some of Herzl's work, and he kind of said that what Herzl's saying is nothing new in the Jewish state, but it's the spirit that's animating us. Now, he thought the only place we can go is our ancient homeland. There's no other alternative. It has to be that. And he became a huge diplomatic figure of relations with the United States, Britain, and even the Jews. And he would later become the first president of Israel. And as we go through these in weeks to come, you'll see the important role that he played. But next is David Gruen. I think that's how you're technically supposed to say his name. He was born in 1886 in Poland as well. Like I said earlier, he moved to the land early in 1906. He saw the need for unity and for a state. He was much more of a hardliner than Chaim Weizmann. But he was personally engaged in the rejuvenating of the land. I mean, I showed you the swamps. He got malaria a number of times from trying to clear out these swamps, but he kept working to make it habitable. And like Ben Yehuda, he noticed the language issues, and he also started, I don't know if it was one of Ben Yehuda's papers, but he was an editor of a paper kind of for a similar purpose of reviving Hebrew. So he wrote this article, his first article, and he signed his name at the bottom. He thought, how on earth can I be calling for a return to the Hebrew language if my name is David Gruen, or David Green as some people say. So right then and there, he scratched out David Gruen and changed it to Ben Gurion, which means the son of a lion cub. And he would later become the first prime minister of Israel. And you can see they had a picture of Herzl at the declaration of the state. Now, there's a bunch of other people, but these are just some of the more remarkable people that God used. And these weren't born leaders. I mean, I forget what he wanted to do when he was younger. Chaim Weizmann was a scientist. I mean, these were not people who were raised to become leaders. These are positions that even Chaim Weizmann admitted. And, I look back on my life, it seems like I was moved in places for certain purposes. That took longer than I thought it was going to. But either way, we got to talk about this, because one of the first things we talked about is if a Jewish state's going to exist, the first thing that has to happen is the land has to be cleared. And there's different prophecies that talk about how this would happen. Now, Daniel 11, I think it talks about the times of Gentile oppression. It starts in Daniel's day. And as the angel Gabriel told him, I'm going to show you what's going to befall your people in the latter days. And I think he begins to show him from Daniel's day the things that would befall his people, the Jews, up to the freeing of the land. So I just have some maps here, kind of breaking down the chapter. Pretty small, so we can fit all of them on here. But just a very brief overview. Daniel 11:2. And first off, I gotta say the importance of all this is that it's chronological, and this will be seen here. And we're typically given new information in the chapter when the land changes hands. And obviously this is worth a 2-week class in itself, but starts in 536 with Medo-Persia over Israel. And you'll notice there's a similarity in all these different empires. So 11:2, that's Medo-Persia. In verses 3 and 4, Alexander the Great takes over the Medo-Persian, the Persian Empire. Again, this empire is almost identical. And then in verse 4, it divides into 4 parts. And from this point, there's only two of these parts have any relation to the land. So we forget about those 2 northern parts and just focus on the king of the north, who's north of the land, and the king of the south, who's south of the land. Obviously, the Holy Land being the focus. And verses 5 through 29 show them, you just trace through history of them battling each other and showing the land belonging to the Seleucids, and then the Ptolemies, and then the Seleucids and the Ptolemies again, and so on. There's a map of them. And I think in 30 to 35, we get into the Roman period, when Rome takes over from the Seleucids and Ptolemies. And I think this brings us actually to the time of Christ. But it's important that even though the Jews are in the land, obviously in Christ's time, Israel, it's not an independent state. It was always under the power of someone else. And that's, I think, verses 30 to 35. And then I think if we read into 36 to 39, we get into the split of the Roman Empire, east and west. The eastern being called the Byzantine Empire. And now, again, just like with when it divided to Alexander's generals, the parts that don't have any relation to the Holy Land aren't talked about necessarily anymore in the chapter, because I think he's following kind of the land there. So now it's the Byzantine Empire. Now this is pretty much just from this point, I think the interpretations vary, but emphasis on the fact that these are chronological things. I mean, it doesn't start here and then it jumps back a few hundred years. It's a chronological prophecy. Now, as verse 39, I think, refers to the Byzantine Empire, that empire fell in 1453 to the Ottomans. Now the beginning of verse 40 indicates, I think, that some amount of time has passed. Because if you read throughout the whole chapter, it says, and this, and then this, and then this. But when you get to verse 40, it says, and at the time of the end, such and such happens. That in itself is an interesting phrase, because it occurs only in Daniel, and it doesn't seem like it refers to one specific time, because in Daniel 8, relation to the ram and the he-goat pushing against each other, we know that happened before even Christ's time in 300 BC. That it says the prophecy is for the time of the end. And I think that brings you, I think it relates to 1967. But either way, I think the phrase, it kind of depends on the context. Furthermore, I think in Daniel 12 is where it says that the angel tells Daniel, seal up the prophecy until the time of the end, which kind of implies that you're not really going to be able to understand it until the time of the end. And obviously, we don't need to wait another 100 years to understand Daniel's prophecy, because most of it, at least, is history now. Now, I think I can do this. We're getting a little short on time. But the fact this is chronological, and the empire fell, the Byzantine Empire fell, that is, in 1453. I think we need to look around this time if there's anything that relates to what he's talking about here. Now, this isn't a full picture of their empires, but if you take the Mamluk and the Ottoman Empire and you look at all of them, you have a similar map to these other powers, the other kings of the north and south. And I believe that history bears out the end of chapter 11, even into chapter 12 some, perfectly. And I think it's called, in this instance, when it says, and at the time of the end this happens, I think it calls it that because the land is about to go into a foreign oppressor's hand for the very last time. I mean, we see all these different people. Only one more oppressor is going to take over the land, and I think this is telling us how it would do that. As you looked at the south there, these were called the Mamluks. Just like all the other kings of the south, they were based in Egypt, specifically in Cairo there. These people, the word Mamluk, it actually means slave. And they, as it says here, they established a dynasty that ruled Egypt and Syria from 1250 to 1517. And like I said, again, they were in Cairo, Egypt, just like the Ptolemies, the other kings of the south. I'm just going to skip through this. This is just kind of a breakdown of what kind of the text says and what I think we're looking for. This is breaking down what the text says. And I think this is related to this war in 1517 that saw the Mamluks, or I think the king of the south at this time, lose the land. And I'm going to have to find a good place to stop because I don't think we'll cover all of this. But so in 1516, the Ottomans, they had taken, they just ended the Byzantine Empire a few years prior. They were expanding, and these people down in the south, called the Mamluks, realized they are expanding, and we need to pretty much act on this first. If we have any hope at all, we need to strike first. So this guy's name is Al-Ghari, who was ruling the Mamluks at the time. He brought all his riches with him. I don't know why he did this, but he brought all his riches with him on his way up to attack the Ottomans. And they left it at a place called Aleppo. It's pretty close to their border there. And they struck first. I've got some videos on this that walk through what happened, but we'll have to get to that next time. But like the scriptures say, actually I need to open that up because that's important. As it says there, the king of the south shall push at him. So it's not the king of the north doing anything yet. King of the south makes the first jab. And it's a push. It's not a destructive blow. I think if you look up the word, it means like a gore or provocation. Now, in response to this, the Ottomans, thankfully, for their sake, they had peace with all their other neighbors at the time, so they brought all of their forces down to their border here. The Mamluks said that this is the biggest army they had ever seen. Now, walking through this, and it says, the king of the north, I think in response to being pushed at, the king of the north comes against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, horsemen, and many ships. He shall enter into the countries and overflow and pass over. It's incredible speed with which he moves. And I think the reason for that is because the Mamluks, they didn't believe in guns. They didn't adopt them at all into their military, whereas the Ottomans had long adopted firearms into their arsenal. So it's literally swords against guns here. And there's a single battle, as I mentioned here, Mars Jubik, that's just right at their border where they met them. With that single battle, the Ottomans gained Syria and half of Palestine, and also what we call Lebanon today. But, I mean, imagine the horses of the Mamluks. They're not used to hearing guns, so their horses are running all over the place because they're scared. And not to mention the fact, like I mentioned earlier, the Ottomans had all their forces. It was 3-1 against the Mamluks. They really didn't have a chance. Now, in relation to the ships, because, I mean, every detail has got to be accounted for, otherwise it's not even possible correlation. But as they moved down the Mediterranean coast, they had an army. Of course, they had an army. They had a fleet of 100 ships that followed them and brought their supplies and things. And as it says, the Ottoman general moved to Damascus. Their army met with no resistance, and Damascus was surrendered without a fight. And we'll just get this bottom part here, just about this naval fleet that they had that supported them. And it says if they didn't have the naval fleet, they wouldn't be able to make the gains that they did because, I mean, that's how there's their food and sustenance things. So their navy was critical to this. I think this is an interesting detail. It says, it doesn't say Israel in verse 41. It says, and he shall also enter into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown. But these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. It doesn't say Israel. And I think there's a reason for that. When we think of the glorious land, I think we all agree it's talking about the land of Israel. And we think of the glorious land, like, well, does that mean that it's beautiful and rejuvenated, or even is this a kingdom age thing? Well, in chapter 11, verse 16, under one of the many Antiochus's rule, the land is also called the glorious land. So it does not necessarily mean that it's just teeming with glory, but for some reason that is the term it uses. But it doesn't say Israel, and I think the reason it doesn't say Israel is because there's no such thing as Israel at this time. Again, they'd been dispersed, and they were still 431 years from an Israel existing. So I think it'd be inaccurate to say he shall also enter into Israel. We'll just go to the end of 43, and then I'll stop here. We're getting pretty much there anyways. It says, these are going to escape out of his hand. So when he overflows, he's not going to take everybody. He's going to take everybody but these three, Edom, Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. This just essentially says the Bedouins who lived in what's modern Jordan today, Edom, Ammon, and Moab, they weren't really influenced by the Ottomans at all. They are pretty much, today, they're the same as they were at this time when the Ottomans overflowed. But also, Daniel in Christ, it says by Isaac Collier, he just mentions the same thing. The Arabs have maintained a remarkable independence. But there's an interesting thing about Ammon. It doesn't say and Ammon. It says in chief of the children of Ammon. And I didn't find this until fairly recently. There are these people called the Druzes. They were Muslims, but they lived in these really fortified places, natural fortifications like mountains. And it says here, the Ottomans had respected the fearsome reputation of the Druzes, and they exempted them from taxation and military service. Now there's a bunch of different maps that show this, but if you look at where Edom, Ammon, and Moab was, I actually need to stop using this. It was up in this period here, and the biggest place where the Druzes was this place called Jabal al-Arab. They were vicious people, so the Ottomans didn't even mess with them. But it says here that he shall have power over the treasures of gold and of silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. Egypt today is not anything near the glory it had in the past, but when the Mamluks had it, this is the Middle Ages, they built these beautiful mausoleums and things like that. It was a really wealthy country at the time. And they also, because of where their empire was, they had sole control of these trade routes and routes to these holy places. So they really were a wealthy nation at the time. Just an interesting detail, similar to like the glorious land thing. It doesn't say that he's going to overflow Egypt and he's going to kill all the Egyptians and send them out. It just says the land won't escape. Even though the Ottomans overtook the land, the Mamluk Sultanate, the Mamluks remained intact as a class, and they continued to exercise considerable influence in the state. They actually were government officials in many cases. Just interesting detail, whether it's warranted or not. Last thing here, Libyans and Ethiopians. Libya is just west of Egypt. And it was after this war, actually of this war, it says that the Ottoman conquest of the Mamluks opened up the nations of Africa to the Ottomans. So after that, I think it was 1551, that they took Libya and this port city of, I'm not going to say that right, Tripolitania. Either way, they took Libya. And Ethiopia, in scriptures it says Cush, so it encompasses some of Sudan and things today. But in 1541, not long after this conquest of the Mamluks, Ethiopia and Sudan, all these places, they become tributary states to the Ottomans. And this is just saying similar things. So we'll stop there.